The seamstress's hands were shaking and Grace pretended not to notice. Paris, October 1968. Grace stood on a small platform in the Chanel atelier, arms outstretched like a scarecrow, while 3 women pinned fabric to her body. The dress was for a state dinner next month, something elegant and appropriate and forgettable. The kind of dress Princess Grace wore. Not the kind of dress Grace Kelly would have chosen, but Grace Kelly had been dead for 12 years. The woman on the platform was someone else entirely, someone who stood very still while strangers touched her body and made adjustments to fabric that cost more than most people earned in a year. She'd been standing here for 40 minutes and her feet hurt and her arms ached and she needed to use the bathroom, but she didn't say anything because princesses didn't complain about discomfort. Princesses were decorative objects, beautiful mannequins for expensive clothes. The head seamstress, Madame Beaumont, circled her slowly, eyes critical. The waist needs to come in another inch. Her Highness has gained weight. Grace's face stayed neutral, but something inside her flinched. She was 38 years old and had given birth to 3 children, and yes, her body had changed. But Madame Beaumont said it like it was a moral failing, like Grace had broken some unspoken contract by allowing her flesh to be human. In Hollywood, they'd been obsessed with her weight too. Every costume fitting had been an examination, every dress size a referendum on her discipline. She'd thought escaping to Monaco would free her from that scrutiny. Instead, it had intensified. A princess couldn't gain weight. A princess couldn't age. A princess had to remain frozen at 26 forever, the beautiful bride in the white lace dress. "Remove the dress," Madame Beaumont instructed. Grace stepped down from the platform and went behind the screen. She could undress herself, but there was a girl assigned to help her, a young apprentice seamstress named Celine who couldn't have been more than 19. Celine's hands fumbled with the zipper. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," she whispered. "I'm nervous." Grace wanted to tell her it was fine, that she was just a person, that there was nothing to be nervous about. But that would have been a lie. She wasn't just a person anymore. She was a symbol, an image, a thing that people projected their fantasies onto. Being nervous around her was the appropriate response. Standing in her slip while Celine hung up the half-finished dress, Grace caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror. The lighting in the fitting room was unforgiving, designed to reveal every flaw in the fabric. It revealed every flaw in Grace too. The slight softness around her middle, the lines beginning to form around her eyes, the way her breasts sat lower than they had 10 years ago. She was aging. Not drastically, not even unattractively, but visibly. And visibility was the problem. Grace Kelly had been frozen in celluloid, forever young, forever perfect. But Grace Patricia Grimaldi, Princess of Monaco, had to keep living in a body that betrayed her with every passing year. Madame Beaumont appeared with another dress, this one for a charity gala. Grace put it on mechanically. The routine was familiar. Stand. Raise arms. Turn. Hold breath while they measured and pinned and criticized. She'd been doing this for years. First in Hollywood costume departments, then in bridal fittings for her wedding, then in endless Monaco appointments for endless royal functions. Her body wasn't her own. It was public property, a canvas for designers, a surface for projection. What she wanted to wear, what felt comfortable, what made her feel like herself, none of that mattered. The only question was, what does Princess Grace look like in this? And the answer was always the same. Perfect. Untouchable. Ageless. "This neckline is too low," Madame Beaumont announced. "We cannot have Her Highness looking improper." Grace said nothing. The neckline was modest by any reasonable standard, but royal standards weren't reasonable. She'd learned that quickly. No cleavage. No tight silhouettes. No bold colors that drew too much attention. Everything had to be elegant, appropriate, safe. In Hollywood, costume designers had used her body to create characters. In Monaco, they used it to erase her. Every dress was designed to make her look like every other princess at every other state function. Interchangeable. Ornamental. Blank. A knock on the door. Madame Beaumont's assistant entered. "Madam, the fabric from Milan has arrived. You're needed in the workroom." Madame Beaumont looked annoyed but nodded. "Continue without me," she told the other seamstresses. But be careful. This is for Her Highness." She left in a rustle of measuring tapes and disapproval. The room felt lighter without her. The remaining seamstresses relaxed visibly. Even Celine seemed less terrified. Grace wondered what that said about her, that everyone around her was always performing, always tense, always afraid of making a mistake. She'd wanted to be loved once. Now she'd settle for not making people nervous. One of the seamstresses, an older woman named Marguerite, caught Grace's eye in the mirror. "Would you like some water, Your Highness? We'll be at least another hour." Grace nodded gratefully. Marguerite disappeared and returned with a glass. Grace drank it standing on the platform, still in the gala dress, pins sticking out of the fabric like tiny knives. "Thank you," she said. Marguerite smiled, a real smile, not the careful diplomatic expression most people gave her. "My daughter wants to be an actress," she said suddenly. "She's 17. Very talented. But I told her it's a hard life. Uncertain. No stability." Grace felt something twist in her chest. "It is a hard life," she agreed. "But it's also..." She paused. "What?" "Fulfilling. It had been, once. Magical. Sometimes. Worth it." She didn't know anymore. "Also what, Your Highness?" Marguerite asked, genuinely curious. Grace looked at herself in the mirror, 48 years old, standing in a dress that cost a fortune, living in a palace, married to a prince. From the outside, she had everything. From the inside, she had nothing. "Also better than the alternative," she said finally. "Tell your daughter to try. Tell her if she doesn't try, she'll spend the rest of her life wondering what if. And wondering is its own kind of death." Marguerite looked startled. It was too honest, too raw. Princesses didn't say things like that. But Grace was tired of lying. Tired of pretending that giving up her career had been a noble sacrifice instead of a slow-motion suicide. Celine was pinning the hem now, on her knees at Grace's feet like a supplicant. Grace looked down at the top of her head, at this young girl who was probably dreaming of becoming a great designer, of dressing celebrities, of making her mark. Did she know what it cost? Did anyone know what anything cost until it was too late? Grace had thought she was making a choice when she married Rainier. She'd thought she was choosing love, stability, a different kind of life. But she hadn't been choosing. She'd been running. Running from Hollywood's pressure, from her father's disappointment, from the exhausting work of being Grace Kelly. And she'd run straight into a cage that was prettier than the one she'd left but just as confining. "Your Highness seems sad today," Marguerite said quietly. She was pinning the bodice, her face close to Grace's. "Is everything all right?" Grace wanted to laugh. Was everything all right? No. Nothing had been all right for years. But how could she explain that to this woman? How could she say that she stood in fitting rooms 3 times a week getting dressed up like a doll and it made her want to scream? That every dress was another costume for a role she never auditioned for? That she missed acting so much it physically hurt, a constant ache in her chest that never went away? "I'm fine," Grace said instead. "Just tired. The children kept me up late." Another lie. The children had nannies. Grace barely saw them during the week. But it was a believable lie, the kind of thing mothers said. Marguerite nodded sympathetically, but her eyes said she knew Grace was lying. Maybe everyone knew. Maybe Grace was the only one who still pretended that the performance was convincing. "There," Marguerite said, stepping back. "I think we're finished with this one. You can change." Grace stepped behind the screen again. Celine helped her out of the gala dress and Grace stood in her slip, grateful for a moment of relative freedom. Through the screen, she could hear the seamstresses talking quietly in French, discussing measurements and fabric and deadlines. They weren't talking about her, but she felt like they were. She felt like everyone was always talking about her, analyzing her, judging whether she was living up to the impossible standard of Princess Grace. She caught sight of herself in a small mirror behind the screen. Without the elaborate dresses, without the armor of couture, she looked ordinary. Tired. Human. This was the Grace that no one saw. The one who stood in her underwear in fitting rooms and wondered how her life had become an endless series of costume changes for a character she didn't understand. In Hollywood, She'd at least known who she was playing. Lisa Carol Fremont in Rear Window. Frances Stevens in To Catch a Thief. Even if they weren't her, they were someone. Princess Grace wasn't even a character. She was an absence, a void, a beautiful surface with nothing underneath. Your Highness, we have 2 more dresses. Marguerite's voice from the other side of the screen. Grace closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. 2 more dresses. 2 more hours of standing still while people touched her and criticized her and turned her into something acceptable. She put on her diplomatic smile and stepped out from behind the screen. Of course, she said. Let's continue. The next dress was for a wedding. Not her own, that dress was in a museum now, a relic of the fairy tale. This was for some European royal's wedding, another one of those interminable events where she had to stand for hours making conversation with people she barely knew. The dress was pink. Grace hated pink. It washed her out, made her look pale and fragile. But Rainier's secretary had chosen it because pink was appropriate for a daytime wedding, and Grace's opinion hadn't been requested. She put it on and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like a cake topper. A decorative nothing. Beautiful, Celine breathed. Grace smiled at her automatically. The girl meant well. She didn't understand that beauty was a trap, that being decorative was a prison, that every compliment on Grace's appearance was a reminder that appearance was all she was allowed to offer anymore. Marguerite was doing something complicated with the waistline, gathering fabric and pinning it in ways Grace didn't understand. You know, Marguerite said conversationally, my mother met you once. In 1955. You were filming in the south of France. She said you were the most beautiful woman she'd ever seen. Grace tried to remember 1955. To Catch a Thief. Cary Grant. The Riviera. She'd been 25, at the peak of her career, about to win an Oscar. She'd been happy, or as close to happy as she'd ever gotten. She'd been working, creating, becoming. That was a long time ago, Grace said. I'm not that person anymore. Marguerite looked up, surprised. Of course you are. You're Grace Kelly. Grace shook her head. No, Grace Kelly was an actress. I'm Princess Grace. They're not the same person. The room went quiet. Even Celine stopped pinning. Grace had said too much, revealed too much. Princesses didn't have existential crises in fitting rooms. They stood still and smiled and let people dress them like dolls. I apologize, Grace said quickly. I'm tired. I didn't sleep well. Marguerite's expression was kind. It's all right, Your Highness. We all have days when we don't recognize ourselves in the mirror. It was a generous interpretation, a way to let Grace take it back. But Grace didn't want to take it back. She wanted to keep going. Wanted to say, I haven't recognized myself in 12 years. I look in the mirror and see a stranger. A beautifully dressed, perfectly coiffed stranger who stole my life and wears it like a costume. But she didn't say any of that. She stood still while they finished pinning the pink dress. Stood still while they brought out the third dress, a navy blue thing for some diplomatic function. Stood still while the afternoon light changed in the windows and Paris moved around outside, full of life and possibility that had nothing to do with her. She'd lived in Paris briefly, in 1955, while filming. She'd walked the streets freely then, ducked into cafes, sat in parks. Now she couldn't even walk into a shop without security and photographers and crowds. She was more imprisoned now than she'd ever been in Hollywood, and the prison was made of silk and diamonds, and everyone thought she should be grateful. All finished, Your Highness, Marguerite finally announced. It was nearly 5 o'clock. Grace had been standing for 3.5 hours. Her entire body ached. The dresses will be ready in 2 weeks. We'll send them to the palace. Grace nodded and went behind the screen one last time. Celine helped her back into her own clothes, a simple Chanel suit, pearls, low heels. The armor of Princess Grace. When she emerged, Marguerite was wrapping up the measuring tapes. Thank you, Grace said. You do beautiful work. Marguerite smiled. It's an honor to dress you, Your Highness. You make everything look elegant. Grace nodded and smiled and thought, but what if I don't want to look elegant? What if I want to look messy and human and real? The car was waiting outside. Grace's security detail helped her in, closed the door, and suddenly she was alone in the back seat as Paris slid past the windows. She leaned her head against the glass and closed her eyes. 3.5 hours of standing still, of being measured and criticized and turned into something presentable. And tomorrow there would be another fitting. Next week, another event. Next month, another dress. It never stopped. The performance never ended. She was 48 years old and she would do this until she died, standing on platforms while people pinned fabric to her body and told her to hold still, hold still, hold still. Monaco appeared in the distance, the palace rising above the sea like something from a fairy tale. Grace felt nothing looking at it. No warmth. No sense of home. Just resignation. She would go back to her rooms, change for dinner, smile at Rainier across the table, ask the children about their day, play her role until bedtime. And then tomorrow, she would do it again. And the day after that. And the day after that. An endless loop of performance with no audience that mattered and no reviews that could save her. She thought about Marguerite's daughter, 17 and wanting to act. She hoped the girl made it. Hoped she got to stand on real stages and play real characters and feel the thrill of transformation that came with good work. Hoped she didn't give it up for anything, not even a prince. The car pulled into the palace gates. Grace gathered her things, checked her lipstick in her compact mirror, prepared to be Princess Grace again. But for a moment, sitting in the back of that car, she let herself remember what it felt like to be Grace Kelly. To walk onto a set and know exactly who she was supposed to be. To hear action and become someone else, someone interesting, someone with a story worth telling. She'd traded that for this. For state dinners and fitting rooms and a title that meant nothing to her. And the worst part was, she couldn't even regret it properly. Because regretting it would mean admitting she'd made a mistake, and Grace Patricia Kelly Grimaldi, Princess of Monaco, didn't make mistakes. She made sacrifices. Noble, gracious sacrifices. That's what everyone believed, so it must be true. She got out of the car and walked into the palace. The staff curtsied and bowed. "Good evening, Your Highness." She smiled and nodded and kept walking. Up the marble stairs, down the long corridor, into her private rooms. Only when the door was closed and locked did she let her face relax. She kicked off her shoes, unpinned her hair, sat down on the edge of the bed. In the mirror across the room, she could see herself. Still beautiful, people would say. Still elegant. Still Princess Grace. But Grace looked at that reflection and saw a woman in a pink dress that she hated, standing on a platform while strangers touched her, and she felt something crack inside her chest. She thought about the fitting room, about Marguerite's gentle questions, about Celine's nervous hands. She thought about standing there for hours being turned into something acceptable, something appropriate, something that wasn't herself. And she realized, this was her life now. Not acting. Not creating. Not becoming. Just standing still while other people decided who she should be. She'd thought marriage would save her. She'd thought leaving Hollywood would free her. But all she'd done was trade one kind of performance for another. At least in Hollywood, the cameras eventually stopped rolling. Here, they never did. Every moment was public, every gesture scrutinized, every wrinkle and extra pound catalogued as evidence of failure. Grace lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in Paris, Marguerite's daughter was probably rehearsing for an audition, hoping for her big break, believing that talent and hard work would be enough. Grace hoped she was right. Hoped the girl got everything Grace had given up. Because someone should. Someone should get to be an actress without apologizing for it, without trading it for a crown, without standing in fitting rooms wondering if the dress or the woman underneath it was the real costume. Grace closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time she'd felt real. The last time she'd been more than a surface, more than a reflection, more than a princess in a pretty dress. She couldn't remember. The fitting room had taken that too, along with everything else. Piece by piece, pin by pin, dress by dress, until there was nothing left but the performance. And the performance, as always, was flawless. Even if the woman underneath it was disappearing. Even if Grace Kelly was gone and Princess Grace was all that remained. even if standing still was the hardest role she'd ever played, and she'd been playing it for 12 years, and she would play it until the day she died. The seamstresses would measure her corpse and say she was beautiful, even at the end. And everyone would nod and agree and never wonder what it cost her. To be beautiful. To stand still. To let them dress her up and parade her around and call it a fairy tale when it was really just a very long, very expensive funeral for a woman who died the day she said yes to a prince.